Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and start listening. Imagine waking before the sun, not because you chose to, but because the fields will not wait for you. Your bed is a sack of straw laid across a dirt floor you share with your family, and, some nights, the family's only ox. There is no glass in your window, only a shutter of woven branches, to keep out the cold. Your hands are already cracked from yesterday's work, and today will ask the same of them, and tomorrow, and every day after, for as long as you live. You will never leave the small patch of land you were born on. You will never learn to read your own name. You belong, in the eyes of the law, not entirely to yourself, but to the Lord whose fields surround your village like a wall with no gate. This was not a single life, but the life of the overwhelming majority of human beings in medieval Europe, for centuries on end. This is the story of the medieval peasant, the person history rarely named, but without whom no king, no cathedral, and no castle could have existed at all. Chapter 1: Birth in Bondage. A peasant's fate was decided before they ever spoke a word, or even before they could open their eyes to see the world into which they had arrived. In much of medieval Europe, particularly between the 10th and the 14th centuries, the majority of the rural population was born into a status known as serfdom. A serf was not a slave in the ancient sense, since he could not be bought and sold as an object separate from the land, but he was not a free man either. He was bound to the manor of his birth, tied to the soil the way a tree is tied to the ground it grows from. If the land changed hands from one lord to another, the serf and his family changed hands along with it, as though they were simply another feature of the property, alongside the mill, the pond, and the boundary hedge. This bondage was not a temporary arrangement. It was inherited, passed down through the blood like eye color or the shape of a nose. A child born to a serf mother became a serf, regardless of the identity of the father, and in many regions this rule was strictly enforced, because it protected the lord's claim to future generations of labor. From the moment of birth, a peasant child represented value to someone else, another pair of hands that would one day plow, sow, reap, and pay dues, and another mouth that the lord's steward would carefully count in the manorial records, kept for that very purpose. Midwifery, not medicine, oversaw the beginning of nearly every peasant life. There were no hospitals in the countryside, and no physicians for people of this class, only the older women of the village who had learned through long experience how to bring a child safely, or not safely, into the world. Death in childbirth was common, for both mother and infant, and grief over lost children was woven so thoroughly into peasant life that it rarely appears as a dramatic event in surviving records. It appears instead as a quiet, recurring fact, the way weather or the changing seasons appear, something expected rather than extraordinary. A child who survived infancy did not remain a child for long. There was no prolonged period of protected youth, as later centuries would come to understand it. By the age of 6 or 7, a peasant child was already expected to work, gathering firewood, minding poultry, scaring birds away from the seeded fields with shouts and thrown stones, or helping to care for younger siblings, so that their parents could labor without distraction. Toys, in the sense familiar to later generations, barely existed, and where they did, they were simple things carved from wood or fashioned from scraps of cloth, made not bought. Childhood, in other words, was not a stage of life devoted to play and learning. It was an apprenticeship in survival, and it began almost as soon as a child could walk. Names, too, reflected the narrowness of a peasant's world. Most villages drew their names from a small, repeating pool, so that any manor might contain several men called John, or Robert, or William, distinguished from one another only by their trade, their father's name, or some physical trait, such as John the Miller, or Robert Longshanks. Surnames as fixed family names, inherited across generations, only became common among ordinary people later in the medieval period. And even then, they usually described exactly what a person did or where they lived, since a peasant's identity was rarely separated from his labor or his place. To be born a peasant, then, was to be born already defined by your lord, defined by your village, and defined by the endless, unchanging work that awaited you the moment you were strong enough to lift a tool. Chapter 2: The Village and the Manor. The medieval peasant did not live in isolation. He lived within a system so tightly structured that historians later gave it a name: manorialism. At the center of this system stood the manor, an estate controlled by a lord. Whether that lord was a knight, a baron, a bishop, or even a monastery, since the church itself owned vast stretches of farmland and held peasants in service, just as any secular noble did. The manor was divided into several parts, and understanding this division is essential to understanding the peasant's entire existence. First, there was the lord's own land, called the demesne, which the peasants were required to work directly for the lord's benefit, receiving nothing for that labor beyond the privilege of being allowed to farm their own small strips of land elsewhere on the manor. Second, there were the peasants' own holdings, narrow strips of arable land scattered across the open fields of the village, often not gathered together in one block, but spread out in different sections, so that good and poor soil, and land near and far from the village, were shared out somewhat evenly among the households. Third, there was common land, pasture for grazing animals, woodland for gathering fuel and timber, and often a stretch of waste ground that provided a small margin of extra resources for a community that had very little room for error. The village itself was rarely more than a modest cluster of homes gathered around a central point, perhaps a church, a green, or a crossroads. Beyond the houses lay the open fields, usually organized under what is known as the three-field system by the later medieval period, in which the arable land was divided into three sections. One section would be sown with a winter crop, such as wheat or rye, another with a spring crop, such as barley, oats, or legumes, and the third would be left fallow, resting for a year to recover its fertility, before being brought back into use the following season. This rotation was not a matter of preference but of necessity. Without it, the soil would exhaust itself within a few short years, and famine would follow far sooner than it already did. Life in the village was communal in a way that later, more individualistic societies would find difficult to imagine. Because the strips of land belonging to different families lay side by side without fences, decisions about when to plow, when to sow, and when to harvest were not made by each family alone, but by the village as a whole, often through a body known as the manorial court, presided over by the lords. Steward or bailiff, but attended, and in practice, partly shaped by the peasants themselves. This court did not merely settle disputes between neighbors over stray animals or boundary stones. It also recorded deaths, inheritances, and the payments a peasant family owed to the lord, whenever land changed hands from one generation to the next. The lord, for his part, rarely appeared in the village at all. Many lords held several manors across the country, or spent much of their time occupied with military service, court life, or their own estates elsewhere, leaving the daily running of the manor to officials: the steward, who oversaw the estate as a whole, the bailiff, who managed the practical work of farming, and the reeve, a peasant himself, chosen from within the village to supervise the labor of his own neighbors on the lord's behalf. This meant that a peasant's daily encounters with authority were rarely with the lord directly, but with these intermediary figures, men who lived among the peasantry, yet answered upward to a power the ordinary villager could not question, and could rarely even see. The manor, in this sense, was less like a single household and more like an entire miniature world, self-contained, tightly governed, and almost impossible to leave. Chapter 3: A Day in the Fields. The peasant's day did not begin with a decision. It began with the light, or often before it, since the earliest hours of dawn were considered too valuable to waste on sleep. In spring and summer, when the fields demanded the most attention, a peasant might rise while the sky was still gray, eat a small portion of bread or pottage to fill his stomach just enough to work, and be in the fields before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. There was no clock to consult, only the position of the sun, the sound of the church bell marking the canonical hours, and the simple, physical urgency of crops that would not grow themselves. Ploughing was among the heaviest of these tasks, and it required both skill and brute strength. A wooden plough, sometimes tipped with iron, had to be dragged through heavy soil by oxen or, for poorer households who could not afford a full team of oxen, sometimes by a horse, or in the hardest cases, by the peasants themselves, pulling in place of an animal they could not afford to keep. Behind the plough walked the ploughman, guiding the blade through the earth, correcting its path, and keeping the furrows straight, since a crooked furrow wasted precious land, and made later planting more difficult. This work bent the back and roughened the hands, and it was repeated season after season, year after year, for an entire working life. After ploughing came sowing, then weeding, then the long wait through the growing months, during which fields still required constant care, clearing stones, chasing off birds and animals that threatened the young crop, and repairing the low earthen banks and ditches that helped drain excess water away from the strips of land. Harvest, when it finally arrived, was the most demanding period of the entire year, a race against time and weather in which an entire village worked from first light until the last usable moment of dusk, cutting grain with sickles, gathering it into sheaves, and carrying it to be threshed. Stored before autumn rains could ruin a year's worth of labor in a single wet week. Even this description understates the reality, because a peasant's labor was rarely devoted entirely to his own strips of land. Under the obligations of manorial system, a peasant, particularly one holding land as a villein, owed a set number of days each week working the Lord's demesne land before he was permitted to attend to his own. This labor, known as week work, meant that during the busiest seasons of the year, a peasant might spend the best hours of daylight ploughing or harvesting fields that would never feed his own children, only afterward turning, exhausted, to the narrow strips that actually belonged to his household survival. On top of this came boon work, additional labor demanded by the Lord during particularly urgent moments such as harvest, for which a peasant received, at most, a simple meal provided by the manor, and no wage at all. Livestock added further labor rather than relief. Oxen needed to be fed, watered, and kept healthy, since the loss of a plow animal could threaten an entire household's ability to farm at all. Sheep required tending and shearing. Pigs, often the cheapest animals to keep because they could forage in woodland for themselves, still needed watching to prevent them wandering into a neighbor's crop, an offense that could bring a fine before the manorial court. Even chickens, the smallest and least demanding of farmyard animals, required protection from foxes and required someone to gather their eggs, a portion of which, like nearly everything else a peasant produced, might eventually be owed to the Lord as a due or a rent. By the time evening came, a peasant's day was still not finished, since animals needed to be settled for the night, tools needed to be cleaned and stored, and small tasks around the house still waited to be done by firelight, or the last gray traces of dusk. Rest, when it finally arrived, was brief, interrupted, and taken on a bed of straw, before the entire pattern repeated itself the following morning, in nearly the same form, for the whole of a person's working life. Chapter 4: The House of Mud and Straw. If a peasant's day was defined by labor, his home was defined by scarcity. The typical peasant house of the medieval period was small, dark and simple, built not by professional craftsmen, but by the peasant himself, often with the help of family and neighbors, using whatever materials the local landscape provided. In many regions, this meant a timber frame filled in with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven branches packed with a paste of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung, left to dry into walls that were sturdy enough to withstand weather, but never entirely free of draughts. The roof, more often than not, was thatched with straw or reed, a material that kept out rain reasonably well when properly maintained, but which also posed a constant fire risk, since a single spark from the hearth could set an entire roof, and sometimes an entire row of houses, ablaze. Inside, the house was typically a single room, or at most two, shared by the entire family and, during the coldest months, sometimes by the household's most valuable animals as well, brought indoors to protect them from frost and theft alike. There was no chimney in the earliest and poorest of these homes, only a simple hearth in the center of the floor, with smoke rising to escape through a hole in the roof, or simply drifting upward and out through gaps in the thatch, leaving the interior air thick and often stinging to the eyes. Furniture was minimal, a rough table, a bench or two, perhaps a single chest for storing what few possessions the family owned, and beds that were, in the truest sense of the word, little more than raised platforms of packed straw, sometimes covered with a simple woven cloth. Floors were bare earth, occasionally covered with rushes or straw that would be swept out and replaced when they became too soiled to bear, though this replacement did not happen nearly as often as modern sensibilities might expect, and the resulting conditions of dirt, damp, and the presence of vermin were simply accepted as part of ordinary life. Windows, where they existed at all, were small, unglazed openings, covered with shutters of wood or woven material, since glass was an expensive luxury reserved for churches, monasteries, and the homes the wealthy. This meant that in winter, a peasant family faced a genuine choice between light and warmth, since opening the shutters let in daylight, but also let in the cold, while closing them kept out the chill, but left the interior in near total darkness. Privacy, in the sense familiar to later centuries, did not exist. Parents, children, and sometimes grandparents or unmarried relatives shared the same single room, ate at the same table, and slept within a few feet of one another. Their lives lived in close and constant proximity, that left little room for solitude of any kind. This closeness was not viewed as unusual, since it was the shared condition of nearly every household of similar status, but it does mean that concepts such as personal space or individual bedrooms, taken for granted in much later periods, would have seemed almost incomprehensible to a medieval peasant family. Outside the house itself stood the toft, a small enclosed yard attached to the home, which typically contained a garden for growing vegetables and herbs, space for keeping poultry, or a pig, and sometimes a small outbuilding for storage, or for sheltering animals, separately from the family's living space. This garden plot, modest as it was, provided a crucial supplement to the household's diet, offering vegetables such as onions, leeks, cabbages, and peas that could fill gaps left by the more unreliable harvests of the open fields. Taken together, the peasant home was not a place of comfort by any later standard, but a functional shelter built for survival, constructed from the cheapest available materials, and shared, out of necessity, by every member of the family it housed. Chapter 5: Hunger as a Way of Life. Few aspects of medieval peasant life were as constant, or as dangerous, as the threat of hunger. This was not hunger in the sense of an occasional missed meal, but a persistent, structural feature of an agricultural system that operated with almost no margin for error. A single bad harvest, brought on by too much rain, too little rain, an early frost, or a plague of insects, could reduce a village's food supply dramatically, and because most peasants had little ability to store large surpluses or to purchase food from elsewhere, the effects of such a shortfall were felt almost immediately and directly at the family table. The peasant diet, even in good years, was heavily dependent on grain since bread, in one form or another, formed the foundation of nearly every meal. This might be a coarse, dark bread made from rye barley, or a mixture of grains, since wheat, the finer grain, was often sold or owed to the lord rather than consumed by the peasant household itself. Alongside bread, the staple food of the medieval countryside was pottage, a thick soup or stew made by boiling grains, peas, beans, and whatever vegetables were available, sometimes flavored with a small amount of bacon fat or a few scraps of meat when they could be spared, but often eaten as little more than a thin, plain broth. This pottage might be eaten twice a day, day after day, month after month, with only slight variation depending on the season and what the household's garden and fields could provide. Meat, by contrast, was a rare luxury for most peasant households across much of the medieval period. Livestock represented significant investment and ongoing value, whether through labor, wool, milk, or eggs, and slaughtering an animal for meat meant sacrificing that future value entirely. As a result, meat typically appeared on the peasant table only occasionally, perhaps at a festival, after an animal had died of illness or injury, or during the autumn, when some animals were slaughtered before winter, because there was not enough fodder to keep the entire herd alive through the cold season. Fish, where available near rivers, streams, or the coast, offered another occasional source of protein, though fishing rights, like so much else, were often controlled and restricted by the lord. Ale, brewed from barley or oats, served as a common daily drink, consumed by adults and often by children as well, partly because water sources in many villages were not reliably clean, and the brewing process reduced some of the risks associated with contaminated water. This ale was typically weak by later standards, providing modest nourishment, as well as drink, and brewing it was frequently a task carried out by women within the household, sometimes for the family's own use, and sometimes to sell in small quantities to neighbors. The precariousness of this diet meant that famine was never a distant or abstract threat, but a recurring and terrifyingly real possibility. Chronic undernourishment weakened the body's resistance to disease, meant that women's ability to conceive and carry pregnancies to term was often affected by poor nutrition, and left communities acutely vulnerable whenever a true famine year arrived, such as the Great Famine that struck much of Northern Europe beginning in 1315, when years of relentless rain ruined harvests across an enormous region, leading to widespread death from starvation and the diseases that followed in its wake. Even outside of such extreme crises, the ordinary peasant existence was one lived close to the edge of sufficiency, where a poor season did not simply mean less comfort, but could mean the literal starvation of the very young, the very old, and the already weak. Chapter 6: Marriage, Children, and Survival. Marriage among medieval peasants was rarely a matter of romance in the sense that later centuries would come to expect. It was, first and foremost, an economic arrangement, a practical joining of two households' labor, land, and resources, undertaken with the survival and stability of the family unit as its primary purpose. This is not to say that affection played no role at all, since evidence from court records and other surviving documents suggests that genuine bonds of care did form between many peasant husbands and wives. But the initial decision to marry, and the choice of partner, was almost always shaped heavily by practical concerns such as the size of a potential spouse's landholding, their family's reputation within the village, and their evident capacity for hard physical work. Because peasant marriage so directly affected the transfer and management of land, the lord of the manor often held a direct interest in it. In many parts of medieval England, for example, a female serf who wished to marry was required to pay a fee to her lord, known as merchet, essentially a payment for permission to marry, particularly if she intended to marry outside the manor, and thereby potentially remove her future labor, and that of her children from the lord's estate. Similarly, if a serf to leave the manor to marry, work elsewhere, or even to send a son to be educated, permission and payment were often required, further reinforcing the extent to which even the most personal decisions of a peasant's life remained bound to the authority of the manor. Once married, a peasant couple typically began having children quickly, and often continued to do so throughout the wife's fertile years, since children represented both immediate and future value to the household. From a young age, children contributed labor, and as they grew older, sons in particular would eventually take over the family's landholding and its accompanying obligations, while daughters might marry into other households within the village or occasionally beyond it. Large families were common, though it is important to understand that large numbers of births did not necessarily translate into large numbers of children surviving to adulthood, since infant and child mortality remained tragically high throughout the medieval period, a reality shaped by poor nutrition, unsanitary living conditions, and the near-total absence of effective medical care. Women within the peasant household carried an immense and continuous burden of labor that extended well beyond childbearing itself. In addition to managing pregnancy, birth, and the care of infants, a peasant wife was typically responsible for a wide range of domestic tasks, including cooking, brewing ale, tending the garden, and small livestock such as poultry, spinning wool or flax into thread, and often assisting directly in the fields during the busiest periods of the agricultural year, particularly at harvest time, when every available pair of hands was needed. Far from being confined solely to the household, peasant women were active and essential participants in the broader economic survival of the family, their labor interwoven so completely with that of their husbands that the household functioned, in practice, as a single working unit rather than as separate spheres of male and female responsibility. Family life, in this context, was governed less by sentiment and more by the unrelenting demands of survival. Elderly parents, when they could no longer work the land themselves, were often supported through formal or informal arrangements with the child who inherited the family holding, sometimes recorded in surprisingly detailed manorial documents specifying exactly how much grain or how many days of care an aging parent was entitled to receive in exchange for handing over their land. Children who survived to adulthood typically remained closely tied to the village of their birth, inheriting not only land, but also the same obligations, the same lord, and very often, the same narrow horizons that had defined their parents' lives before them. Thank you for watching my channel. I hope you enjoyed the historical narration. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. This content was generated by artificial intelligence.